Hey everyone, we're back and we are talking about the Qing Empire in China before moving on to Japan. So, a couple of things obviously that you can see we're going to be talking about today include the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion. We will also talk about the Boxer Rebellion before we start talking about conflicts between China and Japan, and then moving on to what's happening within the Japanese Empire. When the Qing conquered China, and remember, guys, the Qing come from Manchuria, they're the Manchus, and they do not consider themselves to be Chinese. There's a very distinct cultural difference. Just keep that in mind. But anyway, when they conquered China in the 1600s, they restore peace and stability and promote the recovery and expansion of the agricultural economy. As a result, they've laid the foundation for the doubling of the Chinese population between 1650 and 1800. By 1800, population pressure was causing environmental damage and contributing to the increasing number of farmhands, laborers, and merchants. There were numerous sources of discontent within the Ching Dynasty. Various minority peoples had been driven off their land, and many people regarded the government as being weak, corrupt, and perhaps in collusion with the foreign merchants and missionaries in Canton and Macau. Discontent was manifest in a series of internal rebellions in the 19th century, beginning with the White Lotus Rebellion, which lasted from 1794 to 1804. After 1800, the increase in the wealth of Europe and from industrialization increased the interest in trade with China. The British East India Company in the late 18th century had few goods to offer except silver, and the Chinese wanted to exchange that silver with their own goods. But over time, as you guys know, the rest of the world, especially Europe, more specifically Britain, became incredibly concerned about the amount of silver that China had. And Britain's solution, if you will, to this silver problem was to start smuggling opium into China. Opium was exchanged for silver, which is going to be used to buy goods such as tea. But this would lead to the Opium War. Pardon me. Believing that the Europeans were a relatively unimportant people who didn't really have a lot of goods to offer, the Qing did not at first pay much attention to the trade issues or the growth of the opium trade. In 1839, when the government realized just how much harm was being done by the opium trade, they decided to ban the use and import of opium. And they sent a high ranking official to Canton to deal with the matter. At the same time, the Qing refused to allow the British to have a permanent political presence in China. No diplomats. Can you blame them, though, guys? Opium was being smuggled in. People were getting addicted. Opium is highly addictive. Not just the actual drug that's being abused, but today opium is used for painkillers, as you've probably learned in health class, and it's highly addictive. And it also comes with a host of health problems if not taken correctly. As a result of the opium being banned, Britain said, yeah, no, we're going to keep bringing opium in. People want it. It's a hot commodity. And in 1839, the Qing declared that drug traders would be beheaded, and the trade in opium was suppressed, including the dumping of trunks of opium into the sea. This launched the Opium War, 1839 to 1842, and this left China broken and humiliated. The attempt to ban the opium trade would cause the war, and the better armed British naval and ground forces defeated the Qing, exposing China's real military weaknesses, and it forced them to sign the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking and subsequent treaties signed between the Qing and various Western powers gave Westerners special privileges, and it resulted in the colonization of small pockets of Qing territory. Europe was not satisfied with the treaty ports and wanted more of China opened to Western trade. So they've gone from only having Canton as a port to having 5 different ports. And because Britain wins the Opium War, Britain is also granted what's called the most favored nation. And that meant that anything China was willing to do with any other country in terms of tariffs or reduced fees for trading, they automatically had to do with the British. And obviously, this would cause some resentment, including Hong Kong control being given to the British and only going back to China towards the end of the 20th century. As we slide right into the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864. After the Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking, it's also called the Treaty of Nanjing, many Chinese people began to doubt the legitimacy of the Ching Dynasty. China faced many internal pressures from poverty, overpopulation, and bureaucratic misrule. And peasant uprisings became fairly common. In the Northeast, there was also a Muslim uprising. The Taiping Rebellion broke out in the Guangxi province, where poor farmland, endemic poverty, and economic distress were complicated by ethnic divisions that regulated the minority Hakka people to the lowliest trades. And this is actually how the Taiping Rebellion will start. The founder of the rebellion was a man named Hong Xiquan, a man of Hakka background who became familiar with the teachings of Christian missionaries in Canton. Hong declared himself to be the younger brother of Jesus and founded a religious group called the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, or the Taiping Movement, to which he recruited followers from among the Hakka people. By the end of 1850, the Taiping were over 20,000 strong. The Taiping forces defeated imperial troops at Guangxi, and they either recruited or forced, depending on whose side you're on and how you're looking at it, villagers into their segregated male and female battalions and work teams, and they moved eastern and northern parts of China. In 1853, the Taiping forces captured Nanjing and made it the capital of their Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. In the 1860s, British and French troops fought the Taiping on behalf of the Qing. The Qing were finally able to defeat the Taiping with help from military forces organized by provisional governors like Zhang Guofan and with the assistance of British and French forces. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the world's bloodiest civil wars and the greatest armed conflict before the 20th century. The result of the Taiping Rebellion included 20 to 30 million deaths, depopulation, and destruction of rich agricultural lands in central and eastern China, as well as the suffering and destruction in cities and cultural centers of eastern China. The Taiping Rebellion left the Qing even more dependent on foreign aid. That's really not what you want when that's the whole reason the war started in the first place. After the Opium War, many educated Chinese argued that the Qing government had to reform in order to deal with the Western powers. After the 1850s, the expenses of wars and the burden of numerous debts owed to the Western governments made it impossible for the Qing to get out of debt. With the government so deeply in their debt, Britain, France, and the US became active participants in the fiscal and economic recovery efforts that followed the Taiping Rebellion. The real work of recovery was managed by provisional governors like Zhang Guofan, who looked to the US as his model and worked to restore agriculture, reform the military, and industrialize armaments and manufacturing. The reform programs were supported by a coalition of Qing aristocrats, but they were unable to prevent the Qing Empire from disintegrating into a large number of regions in which provisional governors exercised the only real authority, and the emperor remained emperor only in name. With China weakened from the Taiping Rebellion, the British and French demanded that treaty ports be open to them for trade. Thus would lead to a self-strengthening movement created to reform China. Proclaiming their intention to modernize China on the industrial side without sacrificing traditional Chinese culture, Confucian ethics, Western science became the model of the self-strengthening movement. The first area to be reformed was education. Neo-Confucian conservatives objected to the self-strengthening movement. Dowager Empress Cixi, who would reign from 1835 to 1908, ruled as a regent for her over her nephew. And at first she supported this movement, but later she supported anti-Western forces in China, and she wanted to only preserve imperial power. The Empress Dowager Cixi opposed efforts to facilitate foreign trade internally, and Chinese officials secretly encouraged rebellion against foreign technology, which actually weakened their resistance to Western economic pressure. In spite of Cixi's efforts, China continued to be overwhelmed by Western powers and by Japan. In 1898, the Emperor Guangxu attempted to rule China without his aunt's control, and Cixi's retaliation was to have her nephew confined to the palace and put on permanent house arrest. That didn't go so well. Germany would seize the port of Guangdao, continuing the Western pressure on China. And many Chinese in the late 19th centuries ended up joining secret societies. Perhaps one of the most famous of these secret societies was the Boxers, and their proper name was the Society of the Harmonious and Righteous Fists, but again known as the Boxers because they emphasized martial arts. In 1898, the Boxers attacked Christian missionaries, thus beginning the Boxer Rebellion, and they are supported by the Dowager Empress. And the goal is to eliminate any and all foreign influence. The Qing were unable to actually put down this rebellion on their own because it's being led by one of their own. It's being led by a person high in power. And when the European powers come together, the rebellion is quickly put down. During the trouble of the 19th century, many Chinese people left China. And in 1905, the Manchus implemented numerous reforms. And a big example of these reforms was to abolish the examination system. Changing gears a little bit, and we're going to start talking about Japan. We will discuss the issue in war between China and Japan, but I'd like to spend some time focusing on the Meiji Restoration as well. In the early 19th century, you guys already know, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, and local lords had significant autonomy. This system made it hard for Japan to coordinate its response to outside threats, and some local nobles had begun to believe that Japan was at a distinct disadvantage militarily because of the Tokugawa shogunate. Tokugawa society remained very hierarchical in structure. One name that will stand out is Fukuzawa, and he was born in 1835 and he grew up in Osaka. His lower status samurai family was caught between two very different social worlds, and back in their village, Fukuzawa was treated dismissively by the children of higher ranking samurai families. Don't worry, guys, he'll have the last laugh. Education was Fukuzawa's path to success out of his class limitations. Meanwhile, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry had sailed into Edo Harbor. Perry used the presence of his steam-powered ships to threaten the Japanese to open to Western trade or risk an attack by the U.S. Navy. Some daimyo objected to this treaty and accused the shogun of humiliating Japan. By 1863, there were two factions against the shogun, and a civil war erupted, but it was short-lived, and it led to the overthrow of the shogunate in 1868. The new rulers of Japan were known as the Meiji oligarchs. And I find it interesting, Matthew Perry sails in and demands trade. This one act will change the course of Japanese history, because that leads to the Meiji Restoration and the modernization of Japan. In order to present a strong response to the challenge of Western powers, Japan needed to unify behind one cause: revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration established a new imperial government. The Meiji reforms ended the daimyo-ruled domains and established regional prefectures under a centralized government. Fukuzawa's role for the new government was to encourage education and reform. quite perfect for the job because he used education to change his status and his future and used that to create reforms. So again, last laugh, ha, 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 ha. The Meiji were committed to adopting Western methods in order to challenge the West and prevent it from taking over Japan. The Meiji oligarchs were willing to change their institutions and their society to help transform their country into a world-class industrial and military power. The Japanese learned industrial and military technology, science, engineering, and new educational systems. The Japanese sent students to be educated in the West to learn Western culture and practices, while in Japan itself, Western fashions and other markets of that culture became popular. The Japanese government encouraged industrialization. They funded industrial development of the cloth industry and then sold what they made to private investors. They would also begin selling stocks, if you will, or partial ownership of these industries to private investors as well. Many in Japan opposed the Meiji reformations in the 1870s and 80s. With industrialization came an unequal distribution of new economic rewards. Meiji reforms granted the government a direct role in industrial development. Political liberal ideas were only slowly implemented. Kishido Toshiko spoke for women's rights. She was arrested, fined, and silenced. And Fukuzawa even argued that women should have some say in government provided they were educated first. So as you can see, these reforms, the restoration is really giving men a number of rights, but women are being left out. Fukuzawa created a word and concept, enzetsu, meaning public speaking. In 1889, Japan became a constitutional empire with an elected legislature. So just to summarize that for you, the Tokugawa shogunate is overthrown in 1868. By 1889, so 21 years later, Japan becomes a constitutional empire, elected legislature. They have industrialized. They have instituted new reforms, all because someone demanded something unfair. Commodore Matthew Perry demands that Japan open up to Western trade or be attacked. And instead, in 21 years, they become one of the most powerful nations in the entire world. And now they're going to prove it. As early as 1798, the Tokugawa had expressed interest in an aggressive foreign policy on the part of Japan. In the 1880s and 90s, many Western countries were actively pursuing colonies and imperial influences around the world. You guys already know that. Japanese imperialism would take place between the years 1890 to 1910. Japan's leader of the Meiji oligarchs, Yamagata Aritomo, led Japan into a program of military industrialization to expand their sphere of influence, as well as help them compete with European economic power. The first region of Japanese imperial aggression was Korea, where Japan fought China in the Sino-Japanese War between 1894 and 95. And as Japan grew stronger, China grew weaker until Japan defeated China. Later, Japan helped Western forces put down the Boxer Rebellion. In 1890, the Prime Minister of Japan argued that Russia and Britain might intervene in Korea. Japan then showed even more strength by defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Japan finally annexed Korea as a proctorate in 1910. Despite efforts by European nations to limit Japan's growing influence, it gained control of southern Manchuria and then, again, Korea by 1910, making Japan an imperial power. And by 1910, guys, Japan, Germany, and the US will be three of the leading nations in the world. So as you can see, the Japanese Empire in 1870, and then you can slowly see where they begin occupying and expanding. But this goes from 1870 to 1942. So keep in mind what's happening in the world during this time period. All right, we're wrapping up for the week, folks. Remember, this is a double week, so we will be moving on to imperialism and discussing the countries that are imperialized by European powers. We'll be discussing India. We'll be discussing a bit more about China, but we'll also focus on the areas of Southeast Asia and the entire continent of Africa. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, have a great night, guys. Cheers.